The courthouse clerk looked at the docket 3 times before making the call. Judge Harrison had just recused himself from a case involving numbers operations in Harlem. Then Judge Matthews did the same. Then Judge O'Connor. 3 judges. Same afternoon. Same type of case. No explanations. What the clerk didn't know was that 200 blocks north, a man in a pressed gray suit was sitting in an office above Small's Paradise, methodically checking names off a handwritten list. Bumpy Johnson had just demonstrated something that would terrify the New York legal establishment for decades. He didn't just control the streets, he controlled the system. This is the story of September 15th, 1955, the day Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson turned the courtroom into his chessboard. By 1955, the numbers racket was Harlem's economic backbone. Every day, thousands of people placed bets on 3-digit combinations, hoping their nickel would turn into $50. The game employed hundreds, runners, collectors, bankers, and protectors. For a community locked out of Wall Street and most legitimate opportunities, numbers represented hope, employment, and dignity. The New York District Attorney's Office saw it differently. They saw illegal gambling. They saw tax evasion. They saw an opportunity to make headlines by crushing what they called the Harlem Vice Empire. What they didn't see was Bumpy Johnson preparing for war. 3 moves ahead. September had started badly for Harlem's numbers operations. The DA's office had coordinated the largest bust in the city's history. 67 arrests across 12 policy banks. Evidence rooms filled with betting slips. Headlines screaming about the Harlem gambling conspiracy. 3 cases in particular would determine everything. People ver Williams, People ver Henderson, and People ver St. Clair Associates. Each case was assigned to a different judge. Each judge had a reputation for throwing the book at gambling defendants. Each conviction could send dozens of Harlem residents to prison and destroy the community's economic foundation. The conventional response would have been lawyers, appeals, maybe some political pressure. Bumpy Johnson wasn't conventional. What prosecutors never understood about Bumpy was that he thought in systems, not crimes. While they focused on arrests and convictions, he studied relationships, dependencies, and leverage points. By 1955, he'd spent 2 decades mapping New York's power structure like a military strategist studying enemy territory. Bumpy knew Judge Harrison's son attended Columbia Law School on scholarship money that came from a foundation with complex funding sources. He knew Judge Matthews had gambling debts from weekend poker games in private clubs. He knew Judge O'Connor's brother-in-law held a city construction contract that could be scrutinized if certain people started asking questions. This wasn't blackmail in the crude sense. Bumpy never threatened anyone directly. He simply understood that powerful men had complicated lives, and complicated lives created opportunities for conversation. The beauty of Bumpy's approach was its subtlety. No judge would ever admit to being influenced by a gangster, but when a respected banker mentioned during a casual lunch that certain upcoming legal proceedings might affect community investments, well, that was just business advice. When a union leader suggested that some court decisions could impact labor peace in the neighborhood, that was just political insight. When a religious leader worried that harsh sentences might destabilize families and create social unrest, that was just pastoral concern. Bumpy had spent years cultivating relationships with people who had lunch with judges, who played golf with judges, who attended charity galas with judges. He didn't need to speak to judges directly. He had a whole network of respectable intermediaries who could express community concerns in the language of civic responsibility. The morning of September 15th started normally. Judge Harrison arrived at his chambers to prepare for People ver Williams. At 9:30, his clerk informed him that Mr. Davidson from the Municipal Banking Association had called to discuss the economic implications of aggressive prosecution in certain communities. At 10:15, Reverend Thompson from Abyssinian Baptist Church requested a brief meeting about the social costs of excessive incarceration. At 10:45, his golf partner mentioned over coffee that harsh sentences in numbers cases might affect property values and business confidence uptown. By 11:30, Judge Harrison was seeing patterns. The conversations were too coordinated, too precisely focused on his upcoming case. too articulate about specific consequences he'd never considered. Someone was orchestrating this pressure campaign with surgical precision. The brilliant move was this: every person who approached Judge Harrison was absolutely legitimate. The banker really did worry about economic stability. The Reverend genuinely cared about families being separated. The business leader actually was concerned about community relations. But their simultaneous focus on his specific case couldn't be coincidental. Judge Harrison understood that continuing with the trial would send a signal, not just to defendants, but to whoever had organized this sophisticated influence campaign. The message would be clear. Judge Harrison couldn't be reached, couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be made to consider broader implications of his decisions. But recusing himself would send a different message: that he was thoughtful, responsive to community concerns, aware of the complex social dynamics his decisions affected. More importantly, it would demonstrate that he understood how the real power structures in the city functioned. At 11:47 a.m., Judge Harrison called his clerk. "I need to recuse myself from People v. Williams. Potential conflicts of interest have come to my attention." Word traveled fast through the legal community. By noon, Judge Matthews had received similar visits from similar people about People v. Henderson. By 1 p.m., Judge O'Connor was hearing nearly identical concerns about People v. St. Clair Associates. What made the strategy devastating was its respectability. No one could accuse the Municipal Banking Association of taking orders from a gangster. No one could claim Reverend Thompson was compromised by criminal influence. No one could suggest that legitimate business leaders were fronting for illegal operations. Yet the coordination was undeniable. 3 judges receiving the same message about 3 related cases on the same day, through 3 different networks of respected intermediaries. The sophistication was breathtaking. The implications were terrifying. Judge Matthews recused himself at 2:15 p.m. Judge O'Connor followed at 3:30 p.m. By 4 p.m., the courthouse was buzzing with confused conversations. Clerks called the administrative office. Court reporters whispered in hallways. Defense attorneys tried to hide their satisfaction. Prosecutors demanded explanations no one could provide. What emerged in the following days shook the foundations of New York's legal establishment. This wasn't witness intimidation. This wasn't jury tampering. This wasn't even corruption in any traditional sense. This was something entirely new: the systematic application of legitimate social pressure through respectable channels to influence judicial decision-making. Bumpy Johnson had weaponized the establishment's own network against itself. He'd used their social connections, their business relationships, their community obligations as pressure points. He'd turned their respectability into his leverage. The most disturbing aspect was how cleanly it worked. Every conversation was legal. Every concern raised was legitimate. Every person involved could honestly claim they were motivated by genuine civic interest. Yet the result was unmistakable. 3 judges had withdrawn from cases that threatened Bumpy's interests after receiving coordinated pressure from his network. District Attorney Frank Hogan launched an investigation immediately. FBI agents interviewed every banker, reverend, and business leader involved. They found nothing actionable. No direct contact between Bumpy and any of the intermediaries could be proven. No payments changed hands. No threats were made. No laws were broken. What they discovered was worse than corruption. They discovered that Bumpy Johnson understood their system better than they did. He'd identified the informal networks that really drove judicial decisions. He'd mapped the social relationships that mattered more than legal procedures. He'd demonstrated that power in New York worked through dinner conversations and golf partnerships more than gavels and statutes. The immediate victory was significant. With 3 hostile judges removed, the cases were reassigned to more sympathetic courts. Sentences were lighter. The numbers operation survived. Harlem's economy remained intact. But the larger victory was strategic. Every judge in New York now understood that Ellsworth Johnson could reach them without ever entering their courtrooms. Not through crude intimidation, but through the web of social and professional relationships that defined their world. The message was clear. Bumpy didn't need to threaten anyone. He simply needed to remind them that their decisions had consequences beyond their courtrooms. and that someone was sophisticated enough to coordinate those consequences across multiple networks simultaneously. For the next decade, cases involving Harlem numbers operations were handled with unusual delicacy, not because judges were corrupt, but because they understood that their decisions would be scrutinized by networks of legitimate community stakeholders who could make their professional lives complicated in entirely legal ways. Bumpy Johnson had achieved something remarkable. He'd made himself untouchable, not through violence or corruption, but through superior organization and strategic thinking. He turned the system's own mechanisms against itself, demonstrating that real power came not from force, but from understanding how influence actually flowed through the establishment. September 15, 1955, became a case study in sophisticated political maneuvering. Law schools would later analyze the incident as an example of how informal pressure could circumvent formal legal processes. Political scientists would cite it as evidence that power networks operated through social relationships rather than institutional structures. What they missed was the deeper lesson. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson succeeded because he understood that respect was more powerful than fear, that coordination was more effective than intimidation, and that working through the system was more sustainable than working against it. 3 judges, one afternoon, no laws broken, no threats made, no corruption involved. Just a demonstration that true power came from understanding how the game was really played, and playing it better than anyone else in the room. The courthouse clerks still talked about September 15th, decades later, not because of what happened, but because of how cleanly it happened, how completely legal it was, how impossible it was to fight. And somewhere in Harlem, Ellsworth Johnson kept checking names off lists, proving that the most dangerous opponent wasn't the one who broke the rules, but the one who mastered them so completely that he could make the system itself serve his purposes. 3 phone calls, 3 recusals, 1 message that echoed through New York's power corridors for a generation. Bumpy Johnson didn't just run Harlem's streets. He understood how to make the entire city's establishment dance to his rhythm, without ever entering a courtroom, without breaking a single law, without making a single threat, just by proving that he knew exactly how power really worked in America.